The Galactic Senate had seen countless species rise and fall, civilizations with towering intellects and brutal strength, all eventually finding their place in the vast political organism that ruled known space. So when the humans arrived, there was no fanfare beyond protocol, no expectation beyond curiosity. They were latecomers, after all. Their homeworld had only recently stabilized from internal wars and ecological collapse. They brought no weapons, no grand fleets, only a delegation dressed in pressed suits and cautious smiles. Senator Cora of the Thalsari watched from her levitating seat as the human ambassador, a woman named Elise Marin, stood before the council with a calm poise that bordered on disarming. She spoke not of territory or trade routes, but of collaboration, shared values, of healing old wounds between species they had never even met. Cora was intrigued, but not impressed. Words were cheap in the Senate. Empires had fallen because of them. The humans listened more than they spoke, nodding attentively during heated debates, asking small but pointed questions when silence fell. They sent aid packages to overpopulated outposts without being asked. They provided water purification tech to a desert moon facing drought, a gift without condition. Their acts were met with polite thanks, a few murmured jokes about soft-worlders and pet project primitives. Senator Rosin from the Valek Dominion was less generous. "They're trying to buy influence with pity," he muttered to Cora during one session, his voice thick with disdain. "Weakness in the form of charity. They will learn." But learn what? Cora wondered. She couldn't quite explain the unease that had started to coil in the base of her stomach. The humans didn't demand loyalty. They didn't dominate the room. And yet, within a month, half the Senate members were speaking of Earth's innovations, quoting Earth philosophers, even requesting cultural exchange envoys. The shift was subtle, like gravity, gentle, persistent, impossible to ignore. Cora's assistant, a sharp-witted young Crothy named Mivan, offered a different perspective. "They're not weak," he said one evening, poring over reports. "They're effective. They build connections with frightening precision. No manipulation, just relentless sincerity. It's exhausting." The first real test came not through diplomacy, but through disaster. A mining station on the edge of neutral space exploded, killing dozens and leaving hundreds injured. The cause was unclear, sabotage suspected. While the Senate argued jurisdiction, Earth's ambassador sent ships without permission, dozens of human medics and engineers flooding the site, working without rest. They never asked who was to blame. They asked who needed help. By the time the official relief coalition arrived, the humans had stabilized the reactors, set up triage zones, and evacuated the injured. Survivors wept at their feet. Witnesses described not just competence, but compassion. One woman who cradled a dying alien child, whispering comfort despite not knowing the language. Rosin was furious. This is a power play, an unauthorized intervention. Elise Marin replied with a tired smile. No one else was moving. "We did what was right." It wasn't a boast. It was a statement of fact. And somehow, that made it worse. Cora watched the human delegation leave the chamber that day, their pace unhurried, their shoulders square. Not once did they speak of gratitude or recognition. They had come to help, and they had helped. That was enough. Later that week, a senator from the icebound world of Nesh approached Cora privately. "We've accepted a human education grant," she said, almost sheepishly. "They offered to rebuild our northern schools after the frostquake. Free of charge. Can you imagine?" Yes, Cora thought. She could imagine it now. There was a ripple forming beneath the Senate's surface, a current carried not by force or fear, but by quiet, insistent kindness. And it was beginning to pull them all. Mivan leaned in as they reviewed a briefing. "You asked what they're learning," he said. "Maybe the real question is what we're learning. And if it's already too late." Cora didn't answer. She was watching Elise Marin again, standing in the center of the hall, listening to yet another debate not her own. Her hands were folded, her expression serene. There was no threat in her stance, no challenge in her words. And yet, Cora had never been more aware of the power one species could hold, without ever needing to raise their voice. The The Senate had faced conquerors. It had never faced kindness as a strategy. Not until now. The shift wasn't sudden, but it was unmistakable. One by one, worlds began to lean toward Earth, not out of obligation, but attraction. The humans never asked for allegiance. They didn't offer promises of protection or superiority. Instead, they brought libraries, counselors, volunteers. They arrived with open hands and calm eyes, and left behind silence, stunned and grateful. Senator Cora saw it in the smallest things first. A delegation from the Oztari Confederacy quoted a human poem in the middle of a trade negotiation. A war-hardened admiral from the Drati Armada interrupted his own address to mention a Terran song that had altered his understanding of grief. These weren't incidents. They were tremors, shifts in the emotional tectonics of the Senate floor. And at the center of it all, always, stood Elise Marin, endlessly composed and unshakably present. Cora asked for a private meeting. Not out of suspicion anymore. Curiosity had taken root, and it had grown deep. Elise agreed with a nod, and that same infuriating grace she wore like a second skin. They met in one of the unadorned conference chambers beneath the Senate's main dome. No aides, no cameras, just two representatives of vastly different worlds, sitting across from each other over lukewarm tea. "I've been watching you," Cora began, not unkindly. "The Senate has been watching you." "I know," Elise replied. "And still we came. You act like you're not trying to win. But you are. Every day. With every gesture." Elise didn't flinch. "It isn't a game, Senator. Everything in the Senate is a game. That's why we scare you." Cora's silence was not disagreement. There was an honesty to the woman, an unnerving calm in the way she spoke, as if she'd accepted something vast and terrible long ago and chosen, somehow, to remain soft. "You should know," Cora said eventually, "that your influence is spreading faster than any military fleet could have managed." Elise's gaze held steady. "Influence isn't control. We don't want to lead. We want to help. But help has weight. It changes the ground beneath us." Outside the chamber, the world was already shifting. The humans had established a network of cultural centers in the Coreward colonies. Art, literature, language training, open to all, no political conditions. Entire generations of young senators in training began quoting Terran philosophy. Human emotional models, once mocked as primitive, were being studied for conflict mediation across 3-star systems. Even the Valek Dominion had grudgingly accepted Earth's offer to send psychological trauma experts to aid war survivors. Razan's acceptance came with the pretense of strategic advantage. But Cora had seen his eyes when he spoke of the human doctor who had taught his daughter to sleep without fear for the first time. It wasn't just kindness. It was strategy disguised as compassion. Or perhaps it was the other way around. Compassion so genuine it became strategy by accident. Elise never gloated. She merely showed up, over and over, with the patience of someone who had decided long ago that if it took a century to change a mind, it was still worth doing. She was, in a word, relentless. There was a moment, quiet and easily missed, that cemented the Senate's unease. A routine diplomatic session erupted into chaos when two rival factions from the Karenai cluster began shouting threats across the chamber. Security moved in, and tension climbed sharply. Then Elise stood. She didn't raise her voice. She walked to the center of the room, eyes soft, hands open, and she simply asked, "Have you eaten today?" It was absurd. It was disarming. And it worked. The room paused. A confused murmur rippled through the crowd. One of the Karenai commanders laughed, unsure whether it was mockery. Elise repeated the question. Later, no one could explain exactly how it unfolded. Somehow, the Senate adjourned early. The delegates were seen eating together in one of the human-sponsored dining halls. The crisis passed without a single threat being returned. What did she do? Razan demanded later. She reminded them there were people before they were enemies. Cora answered quietly. By now, no one could deny Earth's impact. Worlds that had never spoken were cooperating on infrastructure. Medical systems once guarded as sovereign were being freely integrated with Terran databases. Earth, without demanding anything, had created a new kind of unity. But not everyone welcomed it. Whispers moved through the Senate's back halls. Warnings of dependency, of emotional manipulation disguised as empathy. Plans were drafted to regulate Earth's influence, to put formal constraints on unsolicited humanitarian efforts. It was politics as reflex, the machine tightening its own bolts. But the gears had already shifted, and still, Earth kept giving. As the session closed one cycle, Elise stepped into the hallway beside Cora. They stood in silence for a long time, watching other delegates file past. "You've changed us," Cora finally said. Elise didn't smile. Her voice was quiet. "We didn't come to change you, only to remind you that you could." Then she walked away, leaving Cora with a realization she had no words for. Humanity was not frightening because they demanded loyalty. They were frightening because eventually you wanted to give it to them. And once you did, you weren't sure who you had become. The Senate, once united only by caution, now found itself gravitating towards something more complicated: trust. And perhaps, beneath that, a new kind of fear. Not of war, but of needing humans more than they needed anyone else. The vote was scheduled for midday. A resolution had been drafted, terse and clinical, bearing all the signs of bureaucratic discomfort, regulatory oversight on non-mandated interventions. It was aimed squarely at Earth. Crafted not in open hostility, but in quiet panic, it proposed limits on humanitarian assistance, cultural exports, and educational outreach, couched in the language of interspecies sovereignty. To the humans, it would read as rejection. To the rest of the Senate, it was a plea to slow a tide that no longer asked permission to rise. Senator Cora sat in her seat, hands folded, expression unreadable. Around her, the chamber buzzed with restrained energy. Some senators cast glances toward the human delegation, their faces tight with guilt. Others whispered furiously, debating last-minute shifts in allegiance. Elise Marin, as always, stood still. No arguments, no speeches, only the steady presence that had made so many feel seen and others exposed. Cora hadn't yet decided how she would vote. The night before, she had received a message, not from Earth, but from her homeworld. Her sister, who had once sworn off all things foreign, had enrolled her daughter in a human-sponsored science academy. "She wants to build things that matter," the message read. "She says humans make her believe that's possible." It shouldn't have shaken Cora, but it had. Now, she watched Elise step forward. The ambassador had been granted 3 minutes to speak before the vote. It was a courtesy, not a necessity. Most had already made their decisions. Elise nodded to the assembly, her voice soft but carried by the acoustics of the chamber. "We came not to lead, not to teach, but to participate," she began. "We believe in cooperation because we know what it costs to stand alone. We've done that. It nearly broke us." A murmur passed through the Senate, faint but present. "We don't offer help because we think you're weak. We offer it because we remember being desperate, and we remember who helped us and who didn't." That silenced even Rosin. "We have never asked for tribute, allegiance, or control. We offer aid freely because one day we may need you. And when that day comes, we hope you'll remember us not for our ships or our science, but for our sincerity." There was no dramatic flourish, no plea. She stepped back, her expression unchanged. The chamber held stillness like a breath. When the vote began, the names were called in sequence, each senator casting their stance into the record. Rosin, predictably, voted in favor of the resolution. So did a majority of his allies. But others hesitated. Long seconds passed before answers were given. The younger delegates, those who had studied human history, read their stories, lived on shared outposts. They defied predictions. The resolution failed. By 3 votes. Cora was one of them. The chamber didn't erupt. It deflated. A hush spread like fog, thick with disbelief and quiet relief. Elise bowed her head slightly, not in triumph, but in acknowledgement. Then she turned and walked out, leaving behind a chamber too stunned to applaud or condemn. Later, in the quiet of her office, Cora stared out at the curved skyline of the central hub. Her thoughts spun in half-formed constellations. The humans hadn't won anything tangible. No new positions, no legal power. And yet, the vote meant something far more profound. It meant trust, or, at the very least, the first cautious step toward it. Mivan entered, a datapad tucked under his arm. "They're calling it the kindness vote already," he said dryly. "Half the media are furious. The other half are romanticizing Earth as the moral compass of the galaxy." "And what do you think?" Cora asked without turning. He hesitated. "I think I've stopped trying to figure them out. They're too sincere. It's unnerving. Or it's real. Which is worse in a way." Cora smiled faintly. "That's what scares us, isn't it? Not that they're manipulating us, but that they're not." A new season was beginning in the Senate. Not a revolution. Not yet. But a slow turning, a subtle realignment of values. Earth had not taken power. They had made power irrelevant. At least, the kind that ruled through fear. On one of the outer worlds, a human-led team was helping rebuild ancient ruins with local archaeologists. On another, Earth's linguists were preserving endangered dialects, refusing credit or ownership. Everywhere they went, they left behind something intangible. Hope that wasn't naive, kindness that wasn't conditional. The Senate would resist. It always did. But change had arrived wearing the most unthreatening mask imaginable. And that was the genius of it. Elise Marin, walking alone down the Senate corridor after the vote, passed a pair of senior delegates from the hostile bloc. One of them, a reptilian veteran named Throsk, paused as she passed and said nothing. Only offered a short, reluctant nod. Elise returned it with a smile, so small it barely registered. That Cora realized was how it would spread. Not in sweeping declarations, but in gestures too human to legislate. The galaxy had met conquerors before, but it had never met humans who fought with empathy, who disarmed with humility, and who terrified the powerful by making the powerless feel seen. And somewhere deep in that truth lay the real reason Earth was frightening. Because it wasn't their weapons that the Senate feared. It was their example.